If I compare and contrast, let's say what Crossrail has done, or what Crossrail has maybe done versus what other cities around the world may be doing in building big tunnelling, do you see a fundamental difference, or is this the customary contracting strategy?
No, there are. The approach that many cities take, I mean, say Singapore, awful lot of metro construction going on in Singapore at the moment, and they've got a long programme. Their approach is to package it up into a number of stations and the tunnels between them and give all that to one contractor. So the interfaces between tunnels and stations and the management of that programme all sits with one entity. The approach there is to give the station one station, two stations and the running tunnels to one contractor and make him responsible for all of those interfaces, which in many respects makes life easier. But you are, to a degree, putting all of your eggs in one basket, and you are kind of restricted in the size of contract that you can place.
Just out of interest, Peter, your background, is it predominantly transport, or do you cover all infrastructure areas?
I mean, my background is civil engineering, geotechnical engineering, tunnelling, but I've worked on big civils projects all over the world. So quite a lot of, I have to say, quite a lot of rail projects and some highways, but generally large civil engineering projects that have a lot of stuff in the ground.
Because we are here talking about London, and clearly Crossrail is one of those projects that's going ahead, got a lot of publicity, and I think for anybody who's commuted from Heathrow to try and get to either our office, let alone Canary Wharf, it's going to be a blessing. London's impacted in multiple areas in terms of infrastructure, and the one project that government's recently announced in the UK is HS2.
I don't think we should be thinking about HS2 as a London project. I mean, HS2 is about the rest of the country, and it just happens to be going to London necessarily. But for London, I mean, it's going to have I think it will have a massive impact in that the commuting reach increases, the business reach increases, the ability of the rest of the country to get to London and then on to Europe is significantly improved. The HS2 is primarily about capacity rather than speed, and the West Coast Main Line and to a degree the East Coast are significantly, they're close, if not at capacity. So adding the capacity of HS2, whether it's high speed or not, put aside whether it's high speed, but just the added capacity of HS2 is going to be absolutely essential for the economy to continue.
One of the challenges that I think Arup has addressed through Terry Hill is around planning permissions and costs associated with planning in the UK. In your experience globally, is the process around planning, both approvals and the actual physical act around planning, around places like Old Common unique to the UK, or is this a common problem when doing transport planning?
It's a fairly common problem, but it really depends on sort of the legislative framework that you're sitting in. Here we have a well-developed legislative framework. We have a very rigorous planning process. Or I suppose it depends whether you're talking about statutory planning or just infrastructure planning what you're going to do. Places like the States get embroiled in and to a degree it depends on how much politics starts to play on this. In the States it's all about politics. Here there's a fairly large degree of politics, but the planning process grinds exceeding small, particularly when you get involved in public inquiries and the parliamentary process. You end up with a very good result, but it just takes time to get you there. In other countries, Singapore, for example, much smaller, much lower level of political involvement. Fewer layers of politics to deal with. In America, you've got umpteen levels of politics to deal with, umpteen numbers of elected officials who think they have a view to express. In Singapore, you've got one level of government, decisions are made, stuff happens quickly. You might argue as to whether that's the right approach or not, and what consultation takes place. I think there's more consultation now than there used to be. But certainly things happen much more quickly in places like Singapore or Hong Kong, where there is a much simplified planning process and much fewer levels of government at which decisions can be made or altered.
There clearly must be a cost associated with delay, effectively, both probably, I guess, an economic and a financial
Sure.
cost. Is there a way of estimating that? And in particular, if I'm using the Old Oak Common example, what could actually happen there to improve the process?
Well, I look at Old Oak Common as potentially the sort of the Canary Wharf of the West. I mean, you've got a large area of land there. I mean, it needs somebody to take an integrated view of the whole. How does the land that's available integrate with Crossrail, integrate with West Coast Main Line, integrate with links to Heathrow, integrate with High Speed 2? And if you manage to look at all those coherently, rather than looking at them as all as individual projects, I'm sure you will gain an awful lot more than just looking at them as individual projects. And Crossrail, we're on a course, we're going to build our railway, we're going to have our depot there. If you want to put an HS2 station in the way, you're going to cause a lot of trouble. But you need somebody to take a step back and decide what is overall is the right thing to do. And probably the right thing to do is to put links to HS2 and to use the area for future development. But it does need somebody to take a step back and have a look at that.
By the way, it won't surprise you, I fully agree with that in terms of some degree of centralised planning. Are there examples of other countries that London can learn from in that regard?
Well, I just sort of countries where it is I can see it as a problem. My other experiences are in, spending many years in New York working on 2nd Avenue subway, and the sort of the slow decision making and the politics that gets involved in not making decisions quickly. You end up with the right decision eventually, but you have taken so long to get there that costs have risen, you've missed the benefits. If the simple decision had been made early and at the right level and the project was allowed to move, you could have saved a huge amount of time and money in delivering the project much earlier. I see that the main disbenefit is in slow decision making.
The US is the big dig in Boston,
Sure.
which is a great case study for anybody who wants to consider cost overruns and the
Yeah,
like.
sure.
What lessons can we learn from that and avoid them? And maybe we have on Crossrail already.
I think the big lesson learned in the UK was from CTRL HS1, which was delivered on time, on budget, eventually. And I think it's really about being realistic at the outset and not letting numbers, wishful thinking numbers be used in the planning process. I think there are quite a number of people who knew what the cost of the big dig was going to be right from the early days, but nobody ever allowed those numbers to be spoken because the project would never have gone ahead. On CTRL, there was certainly an approach to the management and the measurement of risk and costing of risk and building that into the cost estimates, which gave realistic timeframes and realistic estimates of what the outturn was going to be. And they were, not so much well known, but everybody worked to them. So there wasn't a constant battle of costs seen to be rising. It was constantly seen that costs were staying within the range that had been estimated because there was rigorous management of risk. And I think maybe that is an area where we've seen problems arise because cost estimates were never adequate at the outset, and nobody ever managed the risks or considered what the risks might be in putting big infrastructure projects in the ground.